Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're so glad that you chose to spend this lovely day outside with us inside for just an hour or so, learning about Ulysses S. Grant. So, my name is Robin, and I'm with the St. Louis County Library's History and Genealogy Department. And I'm going to be moderating this presentation today. We are here again for They Will Make Good Soldiers, General Ulysses S. Grant and the United States Colored Troops. This is a Zoom webinar. We will not be utilizing the chat or the hand raise, but we will be checking the Q&A. So I will be asking Nick those Q&A questions at the end. So if you do have any questions at all as he's going through, please go ahead and put your question in the Q&A. Little bit about Nick, our speaker today. He is a historian and curator at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site right here in St. Louis. Wonderful place to visit. I'm sure he'll probably mention that if you are in town here. If you are out town and you're ever, you find yourself in the St. Louis area, we would definitely recommend it. So without further ado, Nick, if you'd like to take over.
Thanks, Robin. Appreciate it. Always enjoy doing programs for the St. Louis County Library and the History and Genealogy Department, doing some great work and amazing holdings at the new Clark branch. The History and Genealogy section is unbelievable there if you get a chance to see it. So thank you as always for having me. Looking forward to today's program. As the topic, as my title suggests here, we're going to talk about Grant and his relationship with Black soldiers during the American Civil War. And I think we know this, but the term United States Colored Troops, that's the historical term that was used to describe Black soldiers in the military during the Civil War. So I'll be using that term, and the USCT acronym, you'll be kind of hearing that throughout today's presentation. Now, as Robin mentioned, I am the historian and curator at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. We are a unit of the National Park Service in South St. Louis County. We have been here since 1989, so a couple years from now will be our 40th anniversary, which is kind of crazy to think about. But we are right across the street from Grant's farm. And a lot of people, a lot of locals here in St. Louis confuse us for being part of Grant's farm. You can certainly go over there to the Anheuser-Busch site, go see all the farm animals, take the tram around the grounds there, but we are not affiliated with them. This unit of the National Park Service, we have about 10 acres of property that we manage, and we take care of the greenhouse that you see on the screen here, which is ironically called Whitehaven. So the Whitehaven estate is more than 200 years old. This was the childhood home of Julia Dent Grant, the future First Lady. Her family, the Dent family, owned Whitehaven in the years before the Civil War. We'll be talking a little bit about that here in this presentation today. And Ulysses S. Grant, while stationed with the Army at nearby Jefferson Barracks, he met Julia here at her childhood home and began a relationship with Julia. And likewise, we'll talk about that a little bit more in this presentation. So we are very fortunate that this house remained in private hands until 1986. And thankfully, local community members in the 1980s worked very hard to raise awareness and attention about the Whitehaven estate. And in 1989, as I mentioned, the National Park Service took over the site after a law was passed establishing this unit of the Park Service that year. So that's a little bit about us. We're open 7 days a week giving tours of Grant's home. So we're here year round educating people about Grant and his life here in St. Louis. Now, Grant, born and raised in Ohio, born and raised in an anti-slavery family. Grant's parents, particularly his father, Jesse Grant, are strongly anti-slavery. Grant's part of Ohio, Southwest Ohio, growing up in Georgetown, Ohio, strong hotbed of anti-slavery activity, even abolitionist activity. And many people in Southwest Ohio actively working to assist enslaved freedom seekers from Kentucky to try to get their freedom by running away into Ohio. So while we don't know about the Grant family necessarily participating in these activities, Grant did grow up in an anti-slavery environment, and his father, Jesse Grant, even at one point stated that he could not even bear the thought of moving into a slave state. He was a thoroughly anti-slavery man. Having said that, Ulysses S. Grant, the older he gets, he does not necessarily adhere to the same line of thinking as his parents. Grant will go to the West Point Military Academy. He will graduate with the class of 1843. And interestingly enough, while at West Point, Grant tends to gravitate towards Southerners. Some of his best friends, the cadets that were at West Point happened to be Southerners, like James Longstreet, a future Confederate general, Cadmus Wilcox, who is from Missouri, but also becomes a Confederate general, and Julia Dent, Grant's brother. Frederick Tracy Dent happened to be Ulysses Grant's roommate his last year at West Point, and Fred and Ulysses become very close friends during that last year at West Point as well. So when Grant finishes and the Army sends him to Jefferson Barracks, this is his first time west of the Mississippi, but he will receive an invitation from the Dent family, from his former roommate, Frederick Tracy Dent, to come to the Whitehaven estate and meet the rest of the family. And Grant, pretty early on, becomes very enamored with life at the Whitehaven estate. He becomes a frequent visitor to the home. He meets Julia Dent. They begin a courtship. And after a 3-month courtship, Ulysses proposes marriage to Julia on the front porch of the Whitehaven estate. And they will later get married here in the St. Louis area. Now, Grant served in the Army for 11 years, but in 1854, and so for context, about 7 years before the American Civil War broke out, Grant decided to leave the Army and come back to the St. Louis area, and he decides to move to the Whitehaven estate to try his hand at farming on this property. So for 5 years, from 1854 to 59, Ulysses and Julia are raising their growing family of 4 children. And for better or worse, they're living under the same roof as Julia's parents. So Grant's moving in with his in-laws for better or worse during this time here. This is very interesting to think about, because even though Grant has this anti-slavery background, like Abraham Lincoln, he's marrying into a family of enslavers. Here at the Whitehaven estate, the Dent family will enslave upwards of 30 African Americans who are living and working on this property. I mentioned earlier that the Park Service has about 10 acres of the original property today, but when Grant lived in Whitehaven, it was 850 acres. So many enslaved men are out in the fields raising fruit and vegetable crops, but there's also women and children doing all manner of work inside the house, cooking, cleaning, providing care to the white children at the Whitehaven estate. And even the enslaved children doing basic tasks like cutting down weeds, doing laundry, cleaning chamber pots, doing all manner of things to assist with the operation here. One of Julia Dent's sisters, Emma Dent Casey, in reflecting on her time at Whitehaven and her relationship with Ulysses, said the following. She said that Ulysses, quote, may have been uncomfortable with slavery, but not so much that our slaves needed to be forced upon him. So, in other words, whatever Grant may have felt about slavery personally, it wasn't enough to prevent him from deciding to live on a plantation, to work side by side with enslaved men in the fields here of the Whitehaven estate, or to benefit from slavery in any number of ways during his 5 years here at Whitehaven. Grant benefits from slavery on a personal level in a number of different ways. Here in the St. Louis area, there was a common practice called hiring out. And essentially what this was is that individual enslavers here in St. Louis, they did not always have enough work for the enslaved people that they claimed ownership of. And so rather than freeing, or well, I should say, rather than freeing or rather than selling those enslaved people further south or what have you, they would hire out those enslaved people to others in the St. Louis area who needed them. So Ulysses Grant will participate in this hiring out system. There was a prominent fur trading family here in St. Louis, the Sublette family. There's actually a Sublette Street on the hill, the Italian section of town today, but the Sublette family lived in that area when Grant was here in the 1850s. And the Sublette family had an estate sale where there was an enslaved man named George, and Grant paid $116 to have George work alongside him here at Whitehaven for the 1858 calendar year. So Grant does not legally own George because George is owned by the estate, the Sublette family estate, but the Sublette family is directly profiting by hiring out George to Ulysses S. Grant. So we know that Grant hired out at least 2 enslaved people to assist him on the farm here. Some of the other Dent enslaved people owned by the Dent family are also assisting Grant in the fields. And we know that at some point in time, Grant obtained ownership of a man named William Jones. We don't know whether Grant paid money to obtain ownership of Jones, or whether Grant's father-in-law, Frederick Dent Sr., gifted William Jones to Grant. We're not 100% sure of that, and we're not even sure when Grant obtained ownership of William Jones. However, we do know that in early 1859, Grant did make the decision to free William Jones. He went to the St. Louis courthouse, what we call the old courthouse today, and he signed a manumission paper voluntarily freeing William Jones. And within that paperwork, it does say that Grant acquired Jones from his father-in-law, again, although we don't know whether it was for cash or a gift or what have you. But it is nevertheless noteworthy here that Grant is the last of 12 presidents who were enslavers. It's a very strange distinction for Grant to have, and William Jones holds the weird distinction of being the last individual to have been enslaved by a future president. Grant also politically leaned towards the Democrat Party at this time. Without getting too much into it, in the 1850s, the issue of slavery and its future potential expansion in the Western territories is creating new political divides. The newly formed Republican Party, organized in the mid-1850s, is campaigning on the idea of stopping slavery's westward expansion, containing it within the southern slave states where it already exists, but preventing it from expanding into the West. Whereas the Democrat Party is going to have a very severe split, with some Democrats supporting the idea of territorial settlers deciding for themselves whether or not their new states would have slavery or not. So the settlers of Kansas determining whether they wanted Kansas to be a slave state or a free state. And some Southern Democrats even calling for a federal slave code allowing for slavery in all Western territories under federal law. So Grant, while living here in St. Louis in 1856, he does choose to vote for James Buchanan, the Democrat candidate that year, who campaigns on the concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that the settlers themselves would determine whether or not they wanted slavery in their Western territory. So Grant has an opportunity to vote for an anti-slavery candidate with Republican John Fremont in 1856, but he chooses not to do so. So why am I highlighting all of this? Because I think it's very important for us to understand where Grant is when the American Civil War breaks out. This is not necessarily a man who is strongly convinced of the moral evil of slavery. This is not a man who is looking to actively dismantle the institution of slavery or even necessarily stop its expansion into the West. Now, Grant is not a fire-eating pro-slavery zealot, and he's most certainly not calling for disunion over these disagreements over slavery. But I would argue to you that Grant is a little bit closer to the institution of slavery than what some historians tend to portray him to be. in the years leading up to the Civil War. Ron Chernow, in his fairly recent biography of Grant, argued that Grant was strongly anti-slavery while living here in St. Louis. I'm not fully convinced of that argument. This is a political cartoon, actually drawn after the Civil War when Grant is running for president. And this political cartoon is actually intended to sow doubt in the viewer's mind about Grant's reliability to protect Black civil rights after the Civil War. Grant, after the Civil War, when he decides to run for president in 1858, he becomes a Republican and he campaigns on supporting the 15th Amendment, a proposed constitutional amendment to end racial discrimination in voting. But in this particular political cartoon, the artist remembers that Grant had connections to slavery. Grant is portrayed as sort of a hardscrabble farmer here with a little corncob pipe in his mouth. He's casting his vote. And importantly, behind him on the cart here, he's selling firewood, but there's an enslaved man sitting on top of the firewood pile, once again connecting Grant to the enslavement of African Americans. And on the top right corner, the cartoon says, "Vote for Buchanan and extension of slavery." So again, raising concerns about Grant's reliability to protect civil rights after the Civil War. But we'll talk about that a little more at the end of this presentation. So when the American Civil War breaks out in April of 1861, Grant is firmly in the camp of believing that this war was one purely to maintain the Union as it was. This is not a war to fight to end slavery. This is not a war to dramatically alter the nature of the United States Constitution. Grant is offering his services to the Army purely in the attempt to maintain the Union, to keep the 11 seceded states in the South that are proposing to create a Confederate government, to try to keep them in the Union. So, for example, Grant, in some of his early letters, he writes to his father-in-law saying that, quote, "There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want hereafter to be ranked with the latter," strongly believing the importance of maintaining the Union. Grant writes letters to his wife and his father, and interestingly enough, his biggest concern with a civil war, he does not believe it's going to be a long civil war. He believes the U.S. Army is going to rise up and quickly dismantle this proposed Confederate military and maintain the Union. His largest concern is that disunion would lead to a mass slave revolt, insurrections in the South among enslaved people. In a letter to his wife, Grant says, quote, "The worst to be apprehended from civil war is from Negro revolts." Expanding further in a letter to his father shortly after the firing of Fort Sumter, Grant says, quote, "The worst that is to be apprehended from the Negro is now. He may revolt and cause more destruction than any Northern man except the ultra-abolitionist would want to see. A Northern army may be required in the next 90 days to go south to suppress a Negro insurrection. As much as the South have vilified the North, they would go on such a mission and with the purest motives." So in other words, Grant understands here that pro-Confederate Southerners are crowing about the Abraham Lincoln administration, and they're complaining that the Lincoln administration is going to abolish slavery in the South. Grant is saying here that that's not the case at all, and even though these complaints are being heard, he's arguing that the Union Army would gladly go down the South to maintain the institution of slavery if that was what it took to demonstrate to Southerners that Northerners had no intention of touching slavery. So this is Grant's attitude at the beginning of the Civil War. In another letter in the summer of 1861, Grant spent the summer of 1861 here in Missouri. And while in Jefferson City in 1861, Grant wrote to a confidant, quote, "Many seem to be entirely ignorant of the object of present hostilities. You can't convince them but what the ultimate object is to extinguish by force slavery. I wish to whip the rebellion into submission, preserving all constitutional rights. The U.S. Army also took a strong stand against supporting anything like an insurrection at the beginning of the Civil War. Here in Missouri, at the beginning of the war, Henry Halleck, who was a commanding officer for the Department of the Missouri, starting kind of in the fall of 1861, he issues General Orders Number 3, and that order instructs all commanders in the field that if any enslaved people were to run to their camps for refuge, to seek refuge with the U.S. Army, the Army officers would be instructed to turn away those enslaved people and to return them to their enslavers as soon as possible. So at the beginning of the war, this is an order that Grant will enforce as part of his duties as a brigadier general towards the beginning of the war. Now, Grant personally does begin to consider emancipation in 1862. By 1862, we're about a year into the war when Grant fights in the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh, at that point, is the deadliest battle of the Civil War. 25,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing over a period of 2 days. And Grant, through this bloodshed, is beginning to understand that the Confederacy, they're not turning back. The point of no return has been reached. The Confederate military is not going to surrender. The Confederate government is not going to fold and voluntarily return itself back to its allegiance to the Union. And so shortly after the Battle of Shiloh, Grant does write a letter to his father where he states that if the war were to become a war to end slavery, he said, allow it to get to that point legitimately, and he would support that. So in other words, the way I interpret that is that if President Lincoln decided to make the war a war to end slavery, Grant would then allow that, and he would continue serving, and he would fight to end slavery if President Lincoln made that decision. So in late 1862, Grant is going to begin his Vicksburg campaign. So Grant has a very bold plan to maneuver his troops down the Mississippi River to get to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and to take over Vicksburg. And essentially his goal here, which he will be successful in, is to split the Confederacy in half, to have the United States military have full possession of the Mississippi River and to split Texas away from Texas, Louisiana, to separate the Confederacy with the Mississippi River. So in late 1862, as Grant's troops are making their way down the Mississippi Valley, Grant and his fellow officers notice that it's a very desolate and desperate situation in the Mississippi Valley. What is happening is that many of the white planters in these areas are abandoning their plantations. They have fled the area knowing that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy are making their way into Mississippi. And so, even though this General Orders Number 3 is on the books, that doesn't mean much to an enslaved person seeking refuge. So thousands of enslaved African Americans start flooding Grant's camps as he's making his way into Mississippi. Some of these enslaved people at the very beginning ended up being sent to go work in the North. And they were, and so in some cases, there were enslaved people that were sent up to Chicago and hired as paid servants for people living in Chicago. However, not too long after this started happening, Democrats, racist, white supremacist Democrats in Congress put a stop to that measure. However, there's going to be a very innovative change where the U.S. Army, starting with General Benjamin Butler, will now consider enslaved people as quote unquote contraband of war. So these enslaved people seeking freedom with the Army, they're not necessarily going to get their freedom on paper, but by 1862, they will be considered contraband of war. So essentially the U.S. Army could, they will allow for enslaved people to seek refuge in their camps, And they, as contraband of war, these enslaved people, they might offer reconnaissance to the U.S. Army. They might offer intelligence about the whereabouts of the Confederate military. Enslaved people might provide labor in the camps. Enslaved women could be cooking in the camps for the soldiers. Enslaved men doing work, labor around the camps, digging earthworks, building campsites. So essentially here, Grant, with the evolving situation and the contraband policy, he is going to establish refugee camps. Back then, they called them contraband camps, but these refugee camps to essentially provide aid to enslaved people seeking that aid from the U.S. Army. So by the fall of 1862, thousands of enslaved people are working in the camps, working in these refugee camps. Enslaved people are also working on the abandoned plantations. So Grant, in partnership with the Treasury Department, is overseeing enslaved people working on plantations that their enslavers abandoned, and they're earning wages from the Treasury Department for their labors on those lands. Grant also establishes schools within his military lines, allowing for enslaved children to receive a formal education. Grant appoints a chaplain by the name of John Eaton to lead this work in the Mississippi Valley. So the bearded man pictured here at the bottom of the slide, that's Chaplain John Eaton. And so Eaton is the one that's really putting a lot of these ideas into work to establish these camps for enslaved people. And what's also worth mentioning too here is that all of this is happening before President Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation, which is an interesting consideration, given here that it's in 1862 still. John Eaton, in a book he wrote about these camps after the Civil War, Eaton explained Grant's position on why he wanted to establish these camps for enslaved people. And Eaton said in his book, quote unquote, Grant went on to say that when it had been made clear that the Negro, as an independent laborer, could build bridges, roads, earthworks, and so on, it would be very easy to later put a musket in his hands and make a soldier of him. And if he fought well, eventually to put the ballot in his hands and make him a citizen. So Grant is evolving here. He's starting to understand that enslaved African Americans have a vested interest in the success of the Union military. They're anxious to offer intelligence, they're anxious to offer their labor. And African American men are expressing an interest in enlisting in the U.S. Army and potentially serving as soldiers. And Grant is happy to, he's beginning to consider, from a very practical standpoint here, how African Americans can serve as allies to the Union cause. Frederick Douglass, speaking about Grant 10 years later in 1872, stated the following about Grant's refugee camps, quote, a large number of our people, through his orders, were furnished employment within his lines, transportation to homes and places of comfort for themselves and families. Grant's refugee camps represent the full germ of the Freedmen's Bureau before the Emancipation Proclamation, not as a theory, but as a practical solution of the relation of slaves in the South to the suppression of the rebellion and in the interest of the welfare of all concerned. So Frederick Douglass here is essentially, he's calling out Grant and commending him for taking these steps prior to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to try to get a hold on the status and the well-being of enslaved people in the Mississippi Valley during the Vicksburg campaign. So the Emancipation Proclamation, when it is issued on January 1st, 1863, it technically only applies to the Confederate States. So Lincoln calls for the end of slavery in any state that's in active rebellion. So it does not apply to 4 slave states that remained in the Union, including Missouri. Having said that, though, by April of 1863, President Lincoln is going to appoint Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas to begin recruiting Black troops in the Confederate States, especially the Mississippi River Valley. So by 1863, and keep in mind here, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, U.S. Army policy bars African Americans and Native Americans too, anybody, basically any person of color, from enlisting and serving in the U.S. Army at the beginning of the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation provides a doorway for African Americans to offer their services into the military. So Grant will support this work. In April of 1863, he issues an order to all officers reporting to him, and he instructs them to, quote, exert themselves in carrying out the policy of the administration, not only in organizing colored regiments and rendering them efficient, but also in removing prejudice against them. That language of removing prejudice against them really sticks out to me here, because it's not just preparing these troops for service, but it's a mental and a moral change to convince the white soldiers to treat these men as equals as they're being recruited for service into the Union military. Grant initially views Black troops as primarily laborers and candidates for guard duty, not necessarily frontline soldiers. So Grant, at the beginning here, and when Black troops are being recruited, he does not necessarily see them as serving in combat roles. Many of these men had never even used a firearm before, because in the slave states like Missouri, it was against the law for an enslaved person to bear arms. So Grant instead views them as working around the camp building earthworks and performing guard duty. However, during the Vicksburg campaign, a significant episode for Grant was the Battle of Milliken's Bend. Now, Milliken's Bend is on the Louisiana side. It's about 20 miles north of Vicksburg on the Louisiana side. And there were Black soldiers performing guard duty, performing garrison duty in Milliken's Bend. And there was Confederate forces that tried to disrupt Grant's supply lines, and they attacked the Black soldiers at Milliken's Bend. However, even though these Black troops were very green, they were poorly trained and equipped, they fought back and they pushed those Confederate forces out of Milliken's Bend. Grant is extremely impressed, and he is very impressed by the gallantry of these Black soldiers. And he writes a letter to President Lincoln, and he states here, quote, the troops had but little experience in the use of firearms, but had been most gallant, and with good officers, they will make good soldiers. So by the end of the Vicksburg campaign, the Confederates will surrender at Vicksburg on the 4th of July in 1863. By the end of Vicksburg, Grant has had a complete mind shift, and he is fully on board for a war to end slavery. In a separate letter to President Lincoln after Vicksburg, Grant stated the following, quote, I have given the subject of arming the Negro my hearty support. This, with the emancipation of the Negro, is the heaviest blow yet given to the Confederacy. There is no objection to my expressing an honest conviction. That is, by arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally. They will make good soldiers, using that line again, and that taking them from the enemy weakens him in the same proportion they strengthen us. So Grant, again, is really talking in practical terms. He's viewing this as a way to push the Union war effort. If these African-American men are willing to fight, to put their lives on the line to serve the Union cause, we should allow them to do that and to consider them as allies in that effort. He also understands that this is going to prevent the Confederacy from impressing any enslaved people and forcing them to labor for their side of things. And I also think, once again here, Grant is saying here that this is an honest conviction. Grant is not doing this just because President Lincoln says so. He is embracing this because he honestly believes this is the best path forward for both African Americans and the nation at large. Grant also wrote a letter at this time to Elihu Washburn, who was the congressional representative in Galena, Illinois, Northwest Illinois, where the Grants were living when the Civil War broke out. And Washburn was very close with Lincoln, too. And to Washburn, Grant makes a very revealing statement. He says, quote, "I never was an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery before the Civil War. But the North and South can never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery." So Grant is on board here once again, demonstrating to Washburn that he wants the Union restored without slavery. Grant, in early 1864, will be promoted to the rank of lieutenant general by President Abraham Lincoln in March of 1864. This is a three-star rank. This was a rank that was initially retired by Congress, but Congress will bring it back, and Grant will be the first general since George Washington to hold the rank of lieutenant general. With this move, Grant makes the decision that it was in his best interest to go east. Grant initially wanted to stay in the Western theater, fighting in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, et cetera, et cetera. But he realizes that it's best for him to accompany the Army of the Potomac in Virginia. So in 1864-65, Grant is going to be directly fighting General Robert E. Lee in what historians call the Overland Campaign, this effort by Grant's troops to go overland towards Lee's forces to force their surrender and to defeat the Confederacy. Now, most Black soldiers that are enlisting, they're stationed all over the country at this time. But by the end of the Overland Campaign in 1865, about 1 out of every 7 soldiers in Grant's ranks is a United States colored troops soldier, an African American soldier. This is a partial list of some noteworthy experiences that Black troops had on the front lines under Grant's command during the Overland Campaign. Old Aldrich Farm was a short little skirmish near Chancellorsville, Virginia in May of 1864, where the 23rd United States Colored Troop Regiment, and by the way, a regiment is usually between 500 and 1,000 soldiers. So about that number of soldiers in the 23rd USCT Regiment fight at Old Aldrich Farm. Wilson's Wharf is the first major action by United States colored troops during the Overland Campaign. A general named Edward Wild had what was called the African Brigade. And the African Brigade was part of the Army of the James and was used to push Fitzhugh Lee's forces towards Richmond. The Battle of the Crater was an unmitigated disaster for the Union Army. It was an attempt to blow up a giant crater where Confederate soldiers were stationed and to then charge Confederate forces after the crater exploded. Unfortunately, the operation was completely bungled and many Black soldiers were captured by the Confederacy during the battle. The Battle of New Market Heights was arguably perhaps the high point of Black service under Grant in the Overland Campaign. During New Market Heights, Grant ordered a divisionary attack against Confederate fortifications around the Confederate capital of Richmond. USCT soldiers fought in an attack at New Market's Heights, and in the end, they did not win, and the Confederates forced them back from these fortifications at Richmond. But the Black soldiers fought so honorably that after the Civil War concluded, 14 USCT troops were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions in the Battle of New Market Heights. So a very noteworthy battle when studying Black soldiers during the Civil War. Battle of New Market Heights is one of those battles that is worth studying further. Towards the end of the Civil War, in April of 1865, by this point, the Confederacy is in disarray. The Confederate government leaves Richmond, and General Lee's forces are going hungry, and in many cases, they're actively deserting the battlefield and they're going back to their homes. So after the Confederate government abandons Richmond, the U.S. Army will occupy the former Confederate capital, and it will be led by Black troops. Grant makes a decision that Black troops will be the first ones to enter into Richmond and occupy Richmond after the Confederacy abandons the capital. It was also noteworthy here, too, that about 5,000 USCT troops also participated in the Appomattox campaign. And many of those soldiers were in the 2nd Division of the 15th Corps under General William Birney. But these men are actively pursuing the Confederacy. And many of those USC troops will be present when Lee surrenders to Grant, and they will be in the vicinity of the Appomattox area when Lee surrenders to Grant. Another consideration with Grant and Black soldiers are prisoner of war exchanges during the Civil War. And this is a very, very significant aspect of understanding Grant's evolving attitudes towards Black soldiers. At the beginning of the Civil War, an agreement was put in called the Dix Hill Cartel Agreement. And this agreement stated that the Union and Confederate forces, whenever there was a prisoner of war exchange, there would be an equal number of prisoners exchanged between the two sides. So if the Confederacy had 5,000 Union POWs that they were ready to exchange, the Union military would likewise return 5,000 Confederate POWs back to the Confederacy. If there was an imbalance of that, so let's say that there was 3,000 extra Confederate POWs under Union occupation, those additional ones would be put under parole and directed not to fight any longer. Well, this agreement falls apart with the Emancipation Proclamation and the opening of a door for African-American men to offer their services to the Union military. In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, with support from the Confederate Congress, will basically, they do not acknowledge Black soldiers as deserving of the same protections as white soldiers. So Black soldiers captured by the Confederacy face the risk of being impressed by the Confederate military and forced to labor against their will in Confederate camps. And in many cases, Black soldiers are captured and returned and thrown back into slavery into the South. They're sold back into slavery in the South. And this is even the case with free Black Northerners who did not live in the South before the Civil War. They will sometimes, these captured soldiers would be sold into slavery into the South. So the United States military decides that they are no longer going to adhere to the Dix Hill Cartel Agreement, and the POW exchange system will fall apart. Grant is going to he's going to make two different arguments in opposition to the POW exchange system. One is a more practical consideration. So from a practical standpoint, Grant states the following, quote, "It is hard on our men held in Southern prisons not to exchange them, but it is humanity to those left in the ranks to fight our battles. Every man we hold, when released on parole, becomes an active soldier against us at once, either directly or indirectly. If we begin a system of exchange which liberates all prisoners taken, we will have to fight on until the whole South is exterminated." So what Grant is saying is that if we exchange prisoners and we tell these Confederate POWs not to serve in the Confederacy again, Grant fears that they're going to enlist anyway and they're going to get back into the Confederate military and fight again. So rather than seeing that outcome, Grant is willing to stop POW exchanges. But there's also a moral argument here too. Grant opposes POW exchanges if it means that Black soldiers are not deserving of the same rights as white soldiers when it comes to POW exchanges. Several times during the Civil War, Grant is going to call out the Confederate military for their efforts to try and impress Black soldiers into their services or to sell them back into slavery into the South. Following the aftermath of Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, that early battle that Grant was impressed with, Grant heard that General Richard Taylor of the Confederacy were actively executing Black soldiers that were captured on the battlefield. Grant writes to Taylor and asks, quote, if a different line of policy towards Black troops and officers commanding them is being practiced to them as opposed towards white troops. If so, I can assure you that these colored troops are regularly mustered into the service of the United States. And so Grant is saying, hey, they're entitled to the same protections of white soldiers, and we hope you're not executing them after capturing them. Grant, after the Battle of the Vicksburg campaign, states, quote, I cannot see the justice of permitting one treatment for them and another for the white soldiers. I want the Negroes all to understand that they are free men. And after the Battle of New Market Heights, where 14 USCT troops won a Medal of Honor, Grant hears that Black troops are being captured by General Lee's forces. And with regards to about 100 of those captured troops, Grant hears rumors that those Black soldiers are being put on the front lines of Robert E. Lee's camps within firing distance of Union cannons. So in other words, these 100 Black captured troops were essentially becoming human shields for the Confederate military. Grant writes a letter to Lee after New Market Heights and asks Lee, quote, if you propose delivering these men the same as white soldiers. General Lee, in response, stated that he would return, quote, all captured soldiers of the U.S., regardless of color, to Grant's lines, but qualified that, quote, Negroes belonging to our citizens are not considered subjects of exchange and are not included in my proposition. So Lee is adhering to the Confederate talking points here, saying that if a Black soldier is considered the property of one of our white citizens, they will not be returned as part of the POW exchanges. Well, Grant, several weeks later, decides that if Black soldiers, POW soldiers, are going to be used on the firing line as human shields for the Confederacy, he would do the same for Confederate POWs. So he orders Confederate POWs to be put in the line of fire of Confederate cannons in response. Did not take long for General Lee to write back to Grant saying that the Black soldiers, the Black POW soldiers, were removed from the front lines, from the line of fire. It was all due to administrative snafu, and he apologized for the confusion. But he still stated that Confederate law called for formerly enslaved people in the Confederacy to be re-enslaved and returned to their enslavers like other recaptured private property. Excuse me. So Grant, in taking this stance against the unequal treatment of POW soldiers, demonstrates real courage here. And Brooke Simpson, a historian of Ulysses S. Grant, a biographer, famously states that for Grant, by this point in the war, what matters is the color of one's uniform and not the color of their skin. So just to conclude this program here, this does not directly pertain to Ulysses S. Grant, but I did want to highlight that there are Black soldiers in St. Louis during the Civil War. In North St. Louis, at what is today Fairgrounds Park, that was the largest military fort in St. Louis. It was called Benton Barracks. Now, Black soldiers are being recruited in the Confederate States right after the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863. It's going to take longer for the Army to begin recruiting Black soldiers in the border states, largely because in early 1863, in the case of Missouri, Missouri's provisional government is still trying to maintain slavery in Missouri at that time. By late 1863, early 1864, the U.S. Army begins recruiting Black soldiers in and around Missouri. So by 1864, there are Black troops being mustered in at Benton Barracks from the region. So enslaved African Americans here in Missouri are offering their services and getting mustered in at Benton Barracks, but also men from Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas are coming to St. Louis to enlist at Benton Barracks. And also some free Black men from states like Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana are likewise coming to St. Louis as well. So by the end of the Civil War, about 3,700 Black soldiers were mustered in at Benton Barracks, received basic training, and were basically prepped for service in other parts of the country. This very stunning picture we have here is of an unidentified Black soldier at Benton Barracks. The painted backdrop behind the gentleman, that is a very famous painted backdrop. It's called the Benton Barracks backdrop. And so hundreds of soldiers had their photo taken in front of this backdrop. So including many Black soldiers. So this is a really wonderful, tangible reminder of Black service, military service in St. Louis during the Civil War. The four largest regiments that were mustered in and organized in St. Louis were the 62nd, 65th, 67th, and 68th USCT regiments. And one final note, the 62nd and 65th regiments in particular were very anxious after the Civil War to establish an institute of higher education for African Americans in Missouri. And the men of those regiments pooled their funds together of the 62nd and 65th. And those funds went towards establishing what we now know today as Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri's first historically Black college or university, first HBCU. But that was established largely thanks to the Black soldiers of those two regiments and their funds after the Civil War. So in conclusion, by the end of the Civil War, Grant acknowledges that slavery was the cause of the war. In his farewell message to the troops, he thanked the troops for serving to maintain the Constitution, to maintain the Union, and to attack what Grant called the cause and pretext of the war, slavery. With this, I think we can see that Grant is very pragmatic, but he has an ability to evolve. He has an ability to think through new ideas. And on the questions of slavery and race, Grant evolves quite a bit with this. And so by the time he's president of the United States, Grant is convinced that Black Americans are deserving of the same rights as white Americans. So Grant supports the 14th Amendment, establishing due process and equal protection of the laws for all Americans and citizenship for Black Americans. He supports the 15th Amendment, allowing all men, regardless of color, an ability to vote. Excuse me. And Grant also during his presidency will state on numerous occasions his belief that all people, regardless of color, should be treated equally under the law. So I think the story of Grant and Black soldiers is one of evolution, one of being pragmatic, and one of Grant playing a huge role in contributing to the end of the Civil War. The 200,000 Black soldiers that fight under Grant's forces during the war play a huge pivotal role in Union victory, and Ulysses S. Grant understands that. Thank you so much. I went a little bit long, but we do have some time for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, that was absolutely fantastic, Nick. Thank you so much. I only have one question in here so far. So if anybody has any questions or comments, go ahead and put those into the Q&A now. This first question, I think we might be able to almost kind of answer together.
Sure.
It's wondering if anyone knows of the several Sydnor, SYDNOR men from Troy in Lincoln County, Missouri, who were USCT soldiers. So I think this kind of leads us into, so I'm with the history and genealogy department, of course, with library. So oftentimes we will have patrons coming in to do research, and they want to know if their ancestor was possibly a part of the U.S. colored troops. So I wanted to mention just for everyone, I'm of course not familiar with that family specifically, but there are many places that you can find, you can even search by name to find if an ancestor was a part of the U.S. colored troops. Some that come to mind right off the top of my head, and Nick, you may have some other ones, but the National Park Service website does have that soldiers and sailors database that is completely free to use. I love that too, because not only can you look up a person's name to see if they were a soldier, but then you can click on information about their regiment as well and see like what their movements were and possibly what battles they may have been involved in. If you have a St. Louis library card, St. Louis County library card, you can also access Fold 3, which is a database, a military type genealogy database that you can actually use from home. And then I believe Ancestry. So if you have an ancestry.com subscription, or if you are located near a St. Louis County library branch, you can come in and use Ancestry Library Edition, and they have information about the U.S. colored troops as well. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, though, Nick.
You literally like all my tricks, like you literally mentioned all of them there. So the National Park Service, just for a little extra context, during the Civil War sesquicentennial, 2011 to 2015, there was a massive effort to um, collect and organize and digitize all the names of soldiers, individual soldiers who fought in the war. So if you type in NPS Soldiers and Sailors Database, you can do all different sorts of searches. You can search by regiment, you can search by Union or Confederate, you can search by name. So there's a lot of different ways you can play around with it. And what's kind of cool too is that if you do make a hit and you find somebody, that individual will then be connected to their regiment. So just for me personally, I discovered that I have an ancestor so my last name's Sacco, very Italian, but I actually have Irish ancestry too. And my Irish ancestors were here in St. Charles long time ago. And so I found an ancestor. I found his name in the Soldiers and Sailors database. And there was also the link to his regiment, the 49th Missouri Regiment. So I clicked on that, and there was a list of all the battles and the whereabouts of the 49th Regiment during the war. So that's a starting point. But then Fold 3 that Robin mentioned, Fold 3, you can actually, the actual paper file for the soldier. So the enlistment paper that the person signed when they enlisted, every 2 months they did a muster roll. So were they present? Were they not present? Were they in a hospital? All those military records, if you find your individual person, go to Fold 3, and then you can access their actual military records. So, my ancestor, I got his full, it's like a 16-page file of the different files that he filled out when he was mustering in, his service records. And what's really powerful is that for a lot of these African-American men, when they enlist, they just wrote an X. So when you'll see in their enlistment papers that they just have an X written where they signed, that represented their signature. So Fold 3 and Soldiers and Sailors Database are two good starting points. And as you mentioned, the History and Genealogy Department, they have a link to Fold 3 and Heritage Quest, which is kind of like Ancestry.com. There's a lot of census records there as well, too. That's a Heritage Quest is a good one as well.
So Heritage Quest is owned by Ancestry, and actually St. Louis County Library cardholders can use that one from home as well. So great, free, easy ways to look up and see if you have an ancestor. To take that one step further, this would not necessarily be free, but I have helped people at the library with where they have identified their Civil War Black soldier, and then they have actually gone on to request if that person received a pension or if their widow received a pension. You can go on to actually sometimes request those pension papers from the National Archives. Again, that's not free, and some of those have been digitized, but not all of them on Fold 3. So that would cost a little bit of money, but sometimes those can really be a gold mine because that person had to prove who they were, or that person's wife had to prove that they were married to that person. So that pension file may contain documents, genealogy related documents, marriages, and things like that. And I also think too, with what Nick said about, learning what battles they were in or what their troop movements were. It's really neat when you find out that you have a military ancestor, but when you find out the types of things that they went through or the places they were, it really just adds what I like to call meat on the bones. It makes your ancestors more than just names and dates. It makes them, it kind of brings them to life, I guess I would say. So.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let me take a look. Somebody said this is a wonderful presentation, and they
Thank
are
you.
wondering if it has been recorded. Yes, it has been recorded, and it will be up on the library's YouTube channel for the next 30 days. We got another excellent presentation. Somebody asked, will this class count towards the genealogy courses? I'll take that one really quickly. Yes, if you are
Sure.
in Genealogy University, this will count towards those courses. If you are watching this and you are a part of Genealogy University, please go ahead and tell me now in the Q&A. Genealogy University, for those of you who have never heard of that, it's a program that we do here at the library. We usually do it twice a year in the winter and in the fall. And you apply to be part of the class of Genealogy University. And if you're chosen, because we always have more people apply than we have DNA kits, so we do have to do a lottery. But if you're chosen, you can take any 4 of our programs. And at the end of that, you can earn a free MyHeritage DNA kit. However, keep in mind that you can always take all of our classes and programs through the library for free anyway. There just won't be a DNA kit at the end of it if you're not in Genealogy University. Another person said this was a wonderful presentation. And I've got a couple of people who are involved in Genealogy University. So thank you all.
Good.
I don't think I have any more questions for you, Nick, but it was a
Sure.
fantastic program. I thank you all for being with us. Like I said, it was probably hard to choose. Do I want to listen to this or do I want to go outside and enjoy the, the 60-degree temperatures, which we haven't had in so long? So we're thrilled that you decided to join us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And I'll see you for the next program in the future. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great day.